Hi, my name's Rob Chilly and today we're going to talk about what shared development is. Shared development is one of a few different ways that you can build a product, whether that product is for our customers or whether that product is for us to use internally. And for our purposes, we can divide products into two buckets. It's either a shared product or it's a bespoke product, i.e. it's not shared. And when I say a shared product, what I mean is a product that is shared between multiple companies or divisions within the wider group. A good example here would be the global betting platform that's used by both FanDuel and Paddy Power Betfair to provide the betting experience for their customers. Now, building a shared product is great from a reuse perspective, but it's hard. And there are two ways really to build a shared product. You can either build it as a shared service or you can use shared development. So we're going to talk about what a shared service is to show how that's different from what shared development is. So in a shared service, you have a single team on the left there that owns the service, that builds the service, that tests the service, that deploys the service. And all the other teams that this is shared with, they simply use the service. So this might be, for example, a data API that's distributing maybe bet prices, market prices. And you'd have a single team that built this thing, tests this thing, deploys this thing, make sure it all works, make sure it's robust, runs the operations, etc., etc. And then you've got multiple teams who simply consume that API and pull those market prices into their own applications to do what they like with it. That's a shared product because it might be used across multiple divisions, multiple companies, but you've got one team somewhere that owns it, controls it, deploys it, and does everything with it, and everyone else simply uses it. That's a shared service. Shared development is different from that. In shared development, the thing that you're sharing is not a deployment. The thing that you're sharing is kind of the ingredients to make a deployment. So that's the code itself, probably a CI pipeline with tests, and those things are shared. And then anybody who wants to use that has to manage and arrange the deployments themselves. Also, it's not a single team that is contributing to the code and the tests. It's multiple teams that are contributing to the code and the tests. So in this diagram, you can see you've got the code and the tests that are shared in the middle. You've got two teams up the top there who are not only both contributing to the code and the tests, they've also got their own individual deployments because they want to use it. Not all teams have to do all four of those things. So in the bottom left, you've got a team there who hasn't got a deployment, doesn't actually use this thing, but maybe they want a feature in this thing. So what they're doing is they're contributing code and tests to create that feature, and that will feed into everybody else's deployments. And then the team down on the right here maybe doesn't have the time or the capability to contribute to the code and the tests, but they still want to use this thing. Now the key point, they can't just use this thing, they need to manage their own deployments. So the shared thing that they get is the code and the tests. This is shared development. Now there's a lot of sharing going on here. I want to be very clear that this does not mean that the code and the tests are not owned. As we'll see later in this series, there is a very explicit role within shared development that is the owner role. So those code and tests, they are owned, they are maintained, but there's a much more collaborative contribution model to that. So you might have heard of the term inner source. Now, if you're thinking that shared development sounds very much like inner source, that's because these two things are exactly the same. Now, if you haven't heard of inner source is simply comparing this technique with open source. So in an open source model, everything's conducted in public, it's open, but also what you're sharing from an open source perspective, usually free, always free, is the code and the tests for XY thing, whether that's Redis or MySQL or whatever it is. You're sharing code and tests, but everyone needs to manage their own deployments, just like we described for shared development. Now, inner source is simply saying, well, let's do the same thing, but instead of it being open, i.e. entirely public, let's make it inner, i.e. internal to the company. And that's what shared development is. It's inner source or internal open source within the Flutter group. So let's just think for a second about why we would do this. And there's two questions behind the why. The first is, why a shared product? Why not do the easier route of a bespoke product? And the second question really is then why use shared development or inner sourcing rather than a shared service? So let's tackle the why share first. So the answer to this is really simple, really. If many divisions are building the same complicated thing, that's pretty wasteful. And while there's an overhead to building a shared thing, that overhead is usually less than building lots and lots of the same thing. And that word complicated in this sentence is important because that's especially true if that thing is complicated. If that thing is simple, the overhead of all that collaboration might not be worth it. But if it's a complicated thing that's going to take a significant amount of investment and time, it's very much worth pondering the advantages of using shared development or a shared service approach, i.e. a shared product. Now, if we know we want a shared product, why would we use a shared development approach and not a shared deployment? Now, the answer to this is much more nuanced, and I could probably spend a whole 10-20 minutes talking about it, but I'm just going to touch on one really key point, which I think is the most important. And for me, that's when you don't want to centralize the prioritization. So if you think about a shared service, you've got only one team that can make changes to that service. But as you can imagine, all the teams that use it will want some changes. And that central team that manage that change and are going to execute that change, they have a single backlog and they need to prioritize between all the requests coming in from all the different teams. Now that's hard within like a single division or a single company within a division, but as soon as you get across multiple divisions, multiple companies, that becomes really difficult to then weigh up the pros and cons, weigh up the priority of these things, and the overhead of trying to manage that, manage those dependencies and manage the priority of those dependencies, it's really hard. Shared development sidesteps that problem completely. In a shared development model, there's not a single backlog because multiple teams are contributing. So, development can happen in parallel with care. And each of the teams can decide which is top of their backlog. So from a prioritization perspective, if a particular group want a particular thing, as long as it's acceptable to everybody else who's using that product, i.e. as long as they don't veto it, then that group are should be perfectly capable of getting on and doing it themselves. So you don't get into this kind of mess of dependencies and priorities that you do in a shared service model. So let's finish off just by taking a quick glimpse into how. And for that, we'll need to move across and look at GitHub. So here's GitHub, and specifically the Flutter Global organization. This is where code is shared. So you can see around here at the top, we've got over 1,000 repositories, we've got over 1,000 engineers, and a whole bunch of teams. And here is all the different repositories where the code is, and these are accessible across divisions and visible across divisions, and anyone can contribute to these things. Now, we said that shared development wasn't just about sharing code. It's also about sharing tests. And sharing tests is actually harder than sharing code, and actually where we still have a lot of work yet to do. But just as a quick example of that, I've just picked out this example, the FSG service, which I think is a Flutter socket gateway service of some sort. But what I wanted to draw your attention to is here you can see there are some shared tests. They're using GitHub Actions as a shared CI pipeline to do builds and tests. So to summarize, shared development or inner sourcing is sharing code and tests, and we do that via GitHub. All users can contribute from multiple different work backlogs, and while they're shared, the code and the tests are still owned. They're just designed to be open to accept help rather than closed. If you feel like this sort of technique might be a good fit for something that you're doing, then please, or just if you're interested, please feel free to come and join us on Slack at Shared Codebase channel, or come talk direct to me or ping me on Slack. I'm Rob Julian.